Hello, it's Miss Lieb from Lieb Math. I wanted to talk to you about factoring trinomials, specifically using the X method. I've also heard it referred to as the magic X or like a machine. In general, as long as you've checked for GCF first, this method will work every time as long as it is factorable. If this doesn't seem to work, you can always use a different method. Usually if this doesn't work for me, I go straight for the quadratic formula because it might have an imaginary solution. So after you check for a GCF, that's to see if it has a greatest common factor, anything that things have in common, then you would proceed with this, which is the X method. Now, I'm going to explain the 4 steps to you, and it's okay if it seems a little hard at first, because it's a lot of just letters right now. Once we get to the examples, it should be a little easier to follow. So for this first one, you set up the X. A normal trinomial is ax squared plus bx plus c. You take whatever the a value is, that's in front of the x squared, and you multiply it times whatever the c value is. It's the coefficient. So a times c goes on the top of an x, and then you put b on the bottom of an x. On step 2, you're going to try to solve the X puzzle. And if you look up X puzzles online, you can see a lot of just practice on this. This is probably one of the hardest things to kind of get used to, but once you get used to it, it's like magic. This is where the organization comes in. A lot of times people are doing this, and every single method they're trying to do with factoring trinomials, I've found this to be one of the easier ways to set it up. To solve the X, you're looking for 2 factors, and I just called them P and Q. So 2 factors that when you multiply those 2 numbers together, they give you whatever number was on the top. And then when you add those 2 numbers together, they give you whatever number was on the bottom. That is how to solve that X puzzle. Once you've found those 2 numbers, you move on to step 3. And that's simply just to make sure you take these 2 numbers and divide them by a. So whatever a you had to begin with, you make sure you divide both of those by a. Now once you've done that and reduced, you do number 4, which is just to now write it in the factored form. So I put n and d to represent that you have some numerator and some denominator. It could end up being your original p and a, or your original q and a, or if you reduced it, the numbers might change. So I just wrote n and d to represent a number on top and a number on bottom. So you take whatever the bottom number is and you write that first, and then you write x plus or minus depending on if this fraction was a positive or a negative fraction. You keep the sign of whatever these fractions are. And then you put the numerator. And do that for this side as well. And once you've done that, this will end up being your factored form. So now that I've confused you with the 4 steps, let's actually apply them to 3 different examples. And once you see them done over and over again, it should be easier for you to do them yourself. So I'm going to scoot this up so you can see a little better. So I'm going to use this example. My first thing before I do that is I check for a GCF. So I look, it has nothing in common, I can move forward. So the first thing I do is I want to set up the X. So I make a really big X. And then I want to write whatever a times c is on top. So currently, a is actually a 1, so I'm going to go ahead and write that 1 here. Right, there's an imaginary 1 that's written right there. And my c is 8. So if I do 1 times 8, I get 8. So I'm just going to write that on top. 1 times 8 is 8. And then whatever my b value is, I write that on bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and write -6 on bottom. Now I'm looking for 2 numbers that multiply to get 8, but add to get a -6. So how I do this is I systematically go through and write down every single factor of 8, and I'm going to write it off to the side. So I'm going to go ahead and say 1 times 8, and I make sure when I make my columns, my left side is going to go in numerical order, so that way I know I'm not forgetting one of them. If I just try to think them off the top of my head, I might miss one. So if I go 1 times something, and then immediately I'm going to check, can I divide it by 2? And I can. I get 2 times 4 is 8. And then I can't divide it by 3, and if I try dividing it by 4 again, I come back to the same factor, so these are all the factors. Now I'm trying to see, do either of these give me the possibility of setting up a -6? And if I look at just the 1 and the 8, 1 plus 8 would be 9, and 1 minus 8 would give me like a 7. So I know that this could not be a potential answer. Then I look, and 2 plus 4 would give me a 6, and 2 minus 4 would give me a -2. So I know that's not it. So I know that whatever I have, these two signs have to be the same. So these are my factors that I'm writing in here, and I want them to multiply to get a +8, but add to get a -6. And the only way that that's going to happen is if both of these are negative, because a -2 times a -4, negative times a negative would give me a +8, and then a negative plus a negative, I would still get a -6. Think about imagining that number line, and if I'm out at -2 and I continue to go out 4 times, I would end up with a -6. So now I've done step 2. I've solved my X puzzle. And as I told you, that's probably the hardest part. Now comes the simple stuff. Step 3 says divide those numbers by A, so I'm going to divide them by 1. And reduce, but if you notice, there's nothing to reduce. So then I'm going to write my answer. Step 4. Now it says whatever is on top, so whatever my numerator is going to go at the back half, and my bottom is going to go first. So I want to focus on the bottom first. So I can write down 1x, and then it says to keep the sign, so this is a -2, so I'm going to write down -2, and then I want to look at my right side. I'm going to do the same thing. My denominator is a 1, so I'm going to write 1x, and I'm keeping the sign, so I have a -4. And you can write it like that, or you can do what I say is we're lazy in math, so you can not write the 1, because just like I did here, if there's nothing written, it's implied there's a 1 there. So it could look like this, or you could look, most likely you would see it like this, where they don't write the 1s. But either way, it's solved, it's factored. If you were to redistribute this back out, combine like terms, you would end up with this. So that seems simple enough. Let's try this on my example 2. So I check for a GCF. I have a 2x². This is not divisible by 2, so I know that there's not a GCF. Then I make my big X. On top of my X, I want to go ahead and write whatever A times C is. So 2 times -5. And 2 times -5 is going to give me a -10. And then whatever the B is, B goes on bottom. So I have a 9, +9, so I'm going to write +9. Step 2 says I'm looking for 2 factors, where I'm trying to solve my X puzzle. I need 2 numbers that multiply to get the top and would add together to get the bottom. So I'm going to list all my factors. So I start with 1 times 10, 2 times 5, 3 times nothing, 4 times nothing, 5 times 2. So again, I've hit that. So I know those are my only factors. And 2 and 5 are not going to give me a 9. If I add them together, I get 7. And if I subtract them, I get 3. So I can't get a 9 out of a 2 and a 5. But I can out of a 1 and a 10. So those are the ones I want to try and use over here. If I have a 1 and a 10, I want it to be a negative 10. So the only way that's going to happen is if one of these two numbers is negative. And my rule of thumb is whatever sign is on the bottom is the sign of the bigger number, always. So over here, this was a negative 6, and if you notice, my bigger number 4 did match the sign. It's okay if they're both negative, but at least my biggest number has to be the same sign as the bottom. So if my 9 is positive, I know I want my 10 to be positive. So then I could make the other one negative, and then a negative 1 times a positive 10 would give me the negative 10 here, and a positive 10 minus 1 would give me a positive 9. So I've found my two numbers. I've solved my X puzzle. Step 3, I'm going to divide by A, and this time I can reduce. My left side doesn't reduce. It's the exact same as it was before, but my right side, it can reduce. 10 divided by 2 is 5 over 1. So I did reduce that one. Now I'm going to write it in the factored form. So it goes denominator x, so I'm just going to write it all in black right now, denominator x, plus or minus the numerator, and this is a negative, so I'm going to go ahead and write minus 1. And then I do the right side, I'm using my reduced version. My denominator goes first, so denominator x, so 1x, but I don't want to write 1x, because I'm just going to have to get rid of it when I simplify. So I'm just going to write x instead of 1x. And this is a positive 5, so I write plus 5. This is my factored form. This is a much better way than to try and guess and check. If I do this, I will always get the right answer. I don't have to redistribute to know it's right. It's always good to check your answer. So now we're going to do number 3. And on this problem, ding, 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 it has a GCF. If I look, 2x squared minus 4x minus 6, if you think about what all three of those have in common, they all have a 2 in common. So I'm going to divide it by 2. Every single term I'm dividing by 2. And if I think about multiplying this back out, 2 times x squared would give me 2x squared. 2 times negative x would give me negative 4x. 2 times negative 3 would give you the negative 6. So automatically I know that I'm finished with my GCF, and that was good. Now I can proceed to making my x's. So I start making the big X. And really, I'm just trying to focus on factoring this part inside. I'm not going to use the 2 again until later. So then on the inside, my A is 1 and my C is negative 3. So 1 times negative 3 gives me a negative 3. And my B is negative 2. So then I start trying to list all my factors of 3, which there's only a 1 and a 3. And my rule of thumb says which one has to match my negative 2, which one has to match the bottom. The bigger number does. So if this is negative, I know at least this has to be negative. And now I check, does 1 times negative 3 give me negative 3? And does 1 plus negative 3 give me a negative 2? That does work. So I've solved my X puzzle. Now step 3 says divide by A, and my A for this problem, remember, was 1. Now I go ahead and what I would do before you write your answer, and once you get to this point, is if you write your answer in the format like this, this reminds you to not forget to bring that GCF. So don't forget the GCF. don't forget the GCF. It goes out front. And now I'm going to write my factors like I normally did. Denominator times x. So on this left side, I have a 1 and a 1. So remember, I don't write 1x. I'm just going to write x. It's positive, so plus 1. And then on my right side, my denominator first, which is 1. So I don't write it, I just write x. And then it's negative, so I write minus. And then my numerator is 3. So this is my factored form of that. So this was factoring trinomials using the X method. I hope that this helps you. Please make sure to subscribe below and comment if there's any other topics that you would like me to work on for you. Have a great day. Bye.